Aloha guys, Dr. Tom coming back at you from the Hawaiian Islands. I want to reiterate something we talked about in the most recent video. Recall that we were talking about the late great remote viewer Pat Price. And when Dr. Rich Kennett had generated a random number, written it on a piece of paper, put it in a shirt pocket, and was totaled off in a glider and flying around. The important point here, in my opinion at least, is Price did not obtain this number by pure clairvoyance, or he could have just sat there, in his relaxed trance, not really a trance, but a state of relaxation, and discern the number. Now, he certainly had the ability to do that. So did many others. But the point about the glider, the reason I like this story so much, is that he actually got motion sickness from the necklace that Kennett had on, swinging back and forth in front of him while his essence, his spirit, his astral body, whatever you want to call it, was up in that cockpit trying to see into his shirt pocket. Now that also is certainly, I guess we call it a type of clairvoyance, but my point being is in some of these instances, the consciousness of the individual and their mind and their awareness and all has completely separated from their physical body for a period of time. And that about the motion sickness, I think, is a profound story, and it was witnessed by these two fellows, two highly educated people. Putoff was on the ground with Price when he literally was almost getting sick, about the vomit. Okay, we're going to talk about philosophy. The thing about philosophy, guys, the reason I like it so much is it's necessary. You have to have something to rein in the hardcore materialists with all their hardcore mathematics. I mean, there's mathematical proofs and so forth that these people fall in love with. They even talk about how beautiful they are, that just cannot be associated with the real world, but yet they try to do it. Now, some of that, I suppose, is an acceptable and a required method to continue our development of the understanding of the world. But in philosophy, it's okay to ask questions about what purpose our lives have and things about ethics and a variety of things. There's a trend in science that reluctantly suggests that consciousness may be more fundamental than just awareness and experience. It is heading that way, guys, and it's heading that way rapidly. Why? Because just more and more evidence is showing up to suggest it. Okay, in the philosophy of mind-body dualism denotes either the view that mental phenomena are non-physical, or that the mind and the body are distinct and separable. Of course, that goes back to René Descartes. Dualism is originally associated with the great René Descartes, who sought to separate science from the stifling grasp of the church. That was his initial goal. Non-dualism holds that everything is one, and separation of mind and body is an illusion. This began as a belief in Eastern religion and is widely held by spiritual and psychic people today. I lean towards this myself. But is consciousness only an aspect of living creatures? Many say no. Panpsychism is the view that mind or body is a fundamental aspect of reality. That mind or consciousness is a fundamental aspect of reality. Everything is conscious, from subatomic particles to galaxy clusters. Although the physicists generally do not like it, aspects of quantum mechanics are often used to justify panpsychism, particularly the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. In order for virtual particles to appear out of the quantum energy fields, they must be observed or measured or disturbed in some manner. So panpsychism is a view that mind or consciousness is a fundamental aspect of reality, and everything is consciousness, or is conscious, Everything from subatomic particles to galactic clusters. Now, a hardcore, straight-laced, reductionistic science type is not going to like that, obviously. Conscious particles, a famous example of this is the Double Slit Experiment, which we will cover in some detail later on. Particles like photons or electrons behave like waves while being projected through a barrier with two slits. But if we observe them or measure or photograph them in some manner, they behave as particles. Although technically this doesn't require consciousness, the subject is up for debate. Some would argue that this is an example of panpsychism, that particles are conscious. Moving along. More metaphysics. Neutral monism is another concept in philosophy of mind. It is a metaphysical theory that rejects the dichotomy of mind and matter. Proponents of neutral monism believe that the true fundamental nature of reality is neither mind nor matter. It's neutral, which is why they call it neutral monism. Okay, so they're saying, it's neither one. It's some undefined something. Okay, and then there's also idealism. Is the last of the philosophy of mind concepts we'll mention. Idealism is described as a diverse group of metaphysical views that state that reality is in some way indistinguishable or inseparable from human perception or understanding. Everything springs from the mind or idea. Subjective idealism states that objects only exist to the extent that they are perceived by someone. Objective idealism asserts that there is a fundamental consciousness that exists before and independently of human consciousness. All right, interesting. Again, an engineering major with a PhD in physics would probably be appalled by this sort of thing, but that doesn't mean it's not right. It was subjective idealism that Einstein was objecting to when he asked if his friend really believed that the moon is only there when we look at it. I understand his point. Obviously, that could be taken as borderline absurdity to think that objects are only there when we focus our consciousness on them. However, when we get into biocentrism and some of these other very interesting topics, we're going to see that there's reason to believe that that's the case. We're also going to, let's talk a little bit more about the double slit experiment. It's been considered to be one of the greatest and one of the most mysterious experiments of all time in all of science. What it is, to take a barrier with two slits in it, and you can project photons of light through it or electrons, and there's a screen behind it. And as these particles are projected, they go through these slits and make patterns on the screen. If you turn the mechanism on and just let it operate without measuring or observing what's going on at the slits, that's the key to it. They'll form a wave pattern on that recording screen, or that screen. That particles have waves as well as things like particles of light, like photons, but also matter has waves as well. We'll talk about that here soon too. And the thing is that as long as you're not aware of what's happening through the slits, the particles, either electrons or photons, behave as waves and form the patterns of waves on the screen. However, if you photograph it or measure it in some way or observe it in some way, suddenly they start forming the pattern that particles create. So we have to accept the fact that the act of observing this or measuring it or photographing it, interfering in some way at the slits, will change the nature of this and change these waves into particles. And it happens every time. And it happens whether we know it or not. In other words, you can be measuring this. And as long as you're measuring it, you're seeing particles appear on the screen. We're going to go into this, I know, in great detail later. I'll have photographs of the equipment and everything. And you can go over and unplug the machine from the wall, and bingo, it'll start being, as long as you're not watching the screen, it'll start forming a wave pattern again. Now, there's no real answer to this other than it's quantum mechanics on display. the idea that observing or watching or being aware of what's happening at those slits determines the fundamental nature of these particles, whether they form waves or they form particles. And it's been done. It was actually discovered, I think, in the early 19th century. It's been a long time. I forget the individual who did, but it is a famous example, the double slit experiment. And they've also done. They've taken it a long way and done a lot of different things where it shows that particles can go back in time, or they'll know what you could. For example, you can take a photon and split it into two photons with half of the wavelength, so the energy still equals the same. And these particles are now entangled. You've heard of quantum entanglement, and that can be measured and has an effect. And the fact whether one of them is measured, it shows in the other one and things like that. So I've read over this and watched it a number of times over the years, and I still, the more advanced stuff is tricky and hard to follow. But it is extraordinary. Very soon, we're going to talk about the work of Dean Rayden, possibly the most preeminent. We mentioned him briefly when we talked about some meta-analysis and stuff. Or have we talked about him yet? But we will. He's my hero. Dean Rayden did a series of experiments with the double slit experiment using the consciousness of individuals, both in the room with the device and elsewhere in the world, and found some really neat stuff. Because it's been argued now for a long time. The spiritual people, like me, argue that, hey, consciousness is what affects the double slit. And the materialists, as you would imagine, argue that no, it's just when you observe something, you're bouncing photons off of it, and to record in your vision or on an instrument, and that's what's doing it. It's that interference from photons or from measurement, and certainly that will do it. So we can't just dispose of that. Absolutely, they're absolutely right. But what if you set up a series of experiments where all you use is consciousness and nothing else? Dean Rayden did 16 different experiments like that over a period of time. We'll be talking about that very soon. Okay, we've run out of time. I didn't quite get to finish this video previously, so we got extra time for once. That's why I went into a little more detail about the famous double slit experiment. It's really interesting, though, guys. Just observation changes the nature of reality. But again, that's what the Copenhagen interpretation actually says. Now, there's some of them that don't like it, and they come up with other things like the many worlds theory, that there's an infinite number of universes, and the reason you had this psychic experience is because in another universe, your twin did this, and that's all I'll say. Okay, we're going to continue on with our quest for consciousness. We'll be talking about a lot of different things on the next upcoming videos. So, we'll see you then, and continue our fascinating discussion. Also, I have to shamelessly promote my book, The Forces With Us, The Higher Consciousness That Science Refuses to Accept. Astounding proof of the paranormal and psychic phenomena. All right, guys, have a good one. Aloha. It's Dr. Tom signing off.